Arthur Ferrier was born in Glasgow, Scotland in 1890, and as a child he exhibited a distinct affinity for drawing, but his parents were determined that he should get a proper job, and when old enough he enrolled at Glasgow Technical College, emerging a few years later to begin his working life as an analytical chemist in a laboratory in the city. But he carried on drawing in his own time and managed on occasion to get his work published in newspapers and magazines. Before long he was creating more work for a range of others, and in 1910 he also created narrative illustrations for Christina Fraser's collection of Scottish stories, Glints o' Glengonagh, but he didn't yet feel confident enough to give up his day job or the regular income it provided. In 1914 war with Germany was declared, and it wasn't until the conflict ended in 1918 that he finally took the plunge and left his job and Glasgow behind for London in a bid to find success as an illustrator. And in the following year he married Annie McGregor. As soon as he arrived in the capital he set about showing his portfolio around the many publishing houses London boasted at the time, and commissions started to arrive with ever-increasing regularity. There was a small amount of advertising work, but most frequently he was creating generally light-hearted, humorous material for magazines, almost but not quite exclusively in black and white line. And this was undoubtedly Ferrier's strongest suit, and at the time colour work was far from commonplace in magazine publishing. He had been influenced not only by the work of earlier Punch illustrators such as the greatly admired Phil May, but also American pen masters such as Charles Darner Gibson, and he produced similarly fluid and energetic imagery using pen, brush and ink with considerable expressiveness. Because photolithography had all but completely replaced engraving in mainstream publishing by the start of the 20th century, Ferrier was free to create images which were reproduced directly from his originals. He used a sable brush to produce heavier calligraphic sweeping lines, defining the overall pose, and moved on to a pen with a flexible nib to create the energetically rendered finer details, such as the flow of clothing or facial expressions. And like those who had inspired him, he was remarkably adept with this medium and technique. His ongoing success enabled him to rent a studio in fashionable Bloomsbury, and from there he produced a large volume of mostly humorous illustrations and jokes for any number of popular magazines, including The Bystander, The Strand and The Passing Show, among others. His impressive skills were noted by his contemporaries, and from 1922 he became a tutor for a correspondence course, the London School of Cartooning. And in a similar capacity he also wrote quite a few articles for the magazine The Artist about various aspects of his working methods. He also took commissions for narrative work for what were called story papers in Britain, similar in format to American pulp magazines, although they were much more domestic and restrained in content. As the decade rolled out, Ferrier became a ubiquitous presence in British media, most frequently using his formidable skills in monochrome, but with occasional outings into full colour, such as these quite demure painted pin-up covers for Christmas issues of London Mail magazine. And a couple of years later he also produced a few more colour images for the Tatler, although this association appears to have lasted only briefly. Not that this would have particularly concerned him given the volume of other work he was producing as the decade rolled around into the 1930s. It was at this time that he started to use a more overtly comedic and considerably less finely detailed style in the Sunday Pictorial, with a series of gags presented in comic strip form, but which were not actually sequential despite appearances. And he used a similarly brush-driven technique for his illustrated covers for theatrical programmes. But there was also more of his usual highly rendered style in evidence to accompany various pieces of narrative fiction, and a highly unexpected painting foray into men's fashion for a tailor's catalogue published in 1932. It was in the early 1930s that the first of his strip cartoons featuring attractive young female characters appeared in the slender form of Film Fanny, published in Everybody's Magazine. This series centred on a young chorus girl but had no narrative sequencing to speak of, and in reality each instalment was usually a dialogue-based joke. It should not come as any surprise that Ferrier used life models to inform all his illustrations, and he was at pains to point out that he also posed his male characters from life drawing, and not just the comely females. These stills are taken from a short film of him at work, which I couldn't show in its original format, but which provides evidence of him slaving valiantly over a sketch of an attractive young lady in order to capture the pose. Throughout the 1930s he continued to be a ubiquitous presence in British media, and even somewhat of a celebrity, seen in all the right places with the famous and glamorous of the times. In 1937 he illustrated the novel Valdis and Veltra in England, written by John Hunter Blair, which gave Ferrier yet more opportunity to provide agreeable images of young ladies. At this time he also had a regular spot in the Sunday Pictorial with Ferrier's strip cartoon, which, like Film Fanny, wasn't a strip at all, but another collection of mildly racy jokes. When World War II began in 1939 he was of course too old to be considered to fight, and he carried on pretty much as usual with the creation of yet another risque joke series titled Our Dumb Blonde, which was very popular during the years of the war. His ongoing association with all things theatrical continued too, with humorous visual critiques of current stage shows, which were published in the News of the World every week, despite the bombs being dropped on the nation's cities. Unfortunately for Ferrier, his studio in Bloomsbury was hit during the London Blitz, and he was obliged to relocate to the equally desirable borough of Chelsea. Most significantly, he became a regular feature in the magazine Blighty, which gave him the opportunity to keep the troops and civilians smiling through adversity with his blend of attractive girls and dialogue-driven humour. Some, but by no means all, of the illustrations he created for Blighty paid lip service to the fact that the country was at war, if only by including uniformed men and women in his images. But there was no reference whatsoever to the horrors of war, which made the magazine and his imagery very popular with the fighting men, who needed no reminder of their situation. Ferrier evidently saw his function as a morale booster for the troops and civilians alike, and he was conspicuously successful in his mission. As the war came to an end, he created many images, most of which were published in Blighty, celebrating the Allies' victory, and a growing number of which were by this point appearing on the covers and back pages of the magazine in full colour. And naturally enough, he invariably used his talent for the evocation of cheerful, daintily seductive girl characters as the focus of the images, all of which continued to maintain the magazine's wartime success now that hostilities were over. And to kick off the post-war period and a return to normal life, Ferrier created a new strip cartoon, Spotlight on Sally, his third, about a flighty young lady and another excuse for the creation of three-panel gags. But despite its patent repetition of earlier incarnations, it was exceptionally popular and even spawned a revue show in 1947 in London's West End. But not all his work was a repeat of his winning formula. In 1946 he illustrated George Monkland's book about the card game Gin Rummy, with some appealing more cartoon-style visual interpretations and misunderstandings of the terminology used in the playing of the game as spot illustrations to punctuate the text. And a year later he even branched out into children's book illustration with The Adventures of Wallop, but there was a curious mismatch in stylistic terms between the overtly cartoon dog protagonist with all other elements of the illustrations rendered in his more representational style. Unusually for a man of his time, Ferrier didn't have any particular enthusiasm for art rather than commercial illustration, but he did on occasion take commissions to paint portraits of the wealthy at various points during his career. There was an observable increase in his work in advertising in the post-war period, with any number of press ads aimed at the female market. and in 1947 he produced a large volume of jolly duotones designed to encourage working class Brits to take their holidays at any of the numerous Butlins holiday camps which were springing up in resorts around the country. But although Butlins pitched themselves very much at families with young children, Ferrier's images suggested it was more a place for young adults to enjoy more romantic encounters with the opposite sex. At some point along the way, he and his wife had separated, although they never actually divorced, and in 1946 he took up residence in a luxurious apartment in London's Knightsbridge with his girlfriend Frida, and he was living the life that many would aspire to and regularly hosted glamorous parties attended by his famous friends and acquaintances. But his lifestyle didn't appear to impede his prodigious volume of illustration, and it was also in 1947 that Laughs with the Lovelies was published, featuring scantily clad young women, but now rendered and printed in full colour throughout. And as the 1950s approached, there was a sharp increase in the volume of colour work he was creating alongside the continuing mono and duochrome images, particularly for the covers of Blighty magazine. Theatre and show business related commissions continued to be a regular source of income too, with posters and sheet music for any number of frivolous musical productions, and colour was by now also creeping increasingly into his advertising commissions. Although there is very little of Ferrier's work appearing in other countries, in 1951 he did create a series of more overtly cartoon illustrations, with the brushwork well to the fore, for an American insurance company, which were published as press ads in a business magazine. In 1953, the Daily Sketch launched a new strip drawn by Ferrier and written by Peter O'Donnell. Eve was a bid by the newspaper to compete with the Daily Mirror's enduringly popular Jane by Norman Pett. And like Jane, Eve was more an ongoing narrative soap opera rather than Ferrier's earlier self-contained gag-driven strips. It was also conspicuously less driven by titillating images of the heroine, and arguably his finest and most substantive sequential work. By the mid-1950s, many of Ferrier's earlier clients had ceased publication or moved on to commissioning others, but Blighty magazine had become somewhat of a British institution and was the country's best-selling humour magazine at this time. And Ferrier was still one of its most popular features, with his cheerful cover illustrations now regularly printed in full colour rather than the previous duotone of red and black. Such was his popularity in Britain at this time, he was commissioned to create images to be reproduced on plates, cups and other assorted china, some of which extolled the joys of sport, on occasion as an excuse to include the odd pin-up. They sold well and are now sought after collector's items. In 1957 he also created sequential narrative illustrations for the Picture Romance Library, a series of comic book formatted stories aimed at the female market, but the association didn't last long. In the later years of the decade, Ferrier's work in Blighty and elsewhere had lost much of the finer hatched penwork he had made his reputation with, and the heavier use of the brush was much more to the fore. The hatching had by now been replaced with simpler blocks of grey or other colours applied from Ferrier's blue-pencilled instructions to the printer. Whether this was a conscious attempt to modernise his style to fit in better with changing fashions, or a means of reducing the time taken to create each image, I don't know, but it wasn't to the benefit of the visual qualities of the work. In the 1960s, Blighty transformed into a new title, Parade, and from this point on it increasingly turned to ever more explicit pin-up photographs. Ferrier did continue to contribute jokes, using the flat colour overprint he had increasingly turned to, but with far less frequency. His last cartoons appeared in Parade in 1970, and he died in 1973 in London at 83 years old. Unlike others, Arthur Ferrier's death was widely recorded, and he was given an obituary in the Times newspaper, praising his work and detailing his amiable personality and fondness for the good life. Given his celebrity status during his life, it seems rather odd that he now languishes among the lesser-known illustrators of 20th century Britain. As with many of the subjects I've covered in the series, Ferrier's portrayals of the fair sex wouldn't go down at all well in our oddly Puritan and yet more pornographic times. But like the music hall, saucy postcards and carry-on films of 20th century Britain, his images have a refreshing, well-meant sense of fun, a commodity currently in short supply.